We're recording.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dave McKee, president of the Fort Phil Kearny Bozeman Trail Association, so welcome to our Veterans Day program. Restrooms are through the door and to the left. And if you didn't have a chance, I would unashamedly ask you to stop at our membership table on your way out. Always looking for new members. I'd like to do some recognitions this morning, or this afternoon. First, I would like to recognize all the veterans in the room. Could the veterans please stand? There's a couple other special people that I want to recognize. I'll probably embarrass them, but I want to recognize a couple of our advisory board members. We have an advisory board that gives us counsel and their knowledge as we move forth with our mission. And I would particularly like to recognize Mary Ellen McWilliams, one of the original members. Wave your hand here. I think if you drive up by the fort, you see what was the old visitor center. She and her cohorts were responsible for getting that there back in the day. And I'd also like to welcome Mike Penfold from Billings, Montana, who's on our advisory board. Mike's with Our Montana, and they've been up mapping and recording the Bozeman Trail in Montana, doing some field camps and just doing some outstanding work. So visit their website, Our Montana, and see what Mike's up to. But we partner with them. I think, and then the last thing before we start is I'd ask the audience during our presentations, each of our presentations, if you would just hold your questions to the end of each presentation, and then they can go through and answer questions. So we'll begin. I want to introduce our first speaker, H.B. Puckett. H.B. is a Tennessee native and, as most of us know, husband of Joanne Puckett. He has his BS in bachelor's degree in history from the University of Tulsa. He's a retired captain from the U.S. Navy and U.S. Navy Reserve. He was a surface warfare officer, active for 10 years, and then in reserve and intelligence officer for the last 20 years, and he's been recalled twice since the 9/11 incident for duty. Retired aerospace and defense engineer and program manager. And then I want to add the piece that I added. He has pursued research on a variety of historic topics, including the American Indian Code Talkers of World War I and World War II. It's a fascinating program, as well as the stories of the American POWs during the Vietnam War, which is just a must to remember. He's a member of our association. If you've come to other events, you may have seen some of HB's presentations. You've probably seen him moving around in the background at other events, setting up chairs, sweeping floors, setting up a sound system, doing whatever needs to be done to host our speakers and our attendees. So with that, I'd like to introduce H.B. Puckett.
All right, thanks, Dave. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the sweeping. Anybody else, any other Navy or coasties in here? Sweepers, man your brooms. Give the ship a clean sweep down fore and aft. Sweep down all well decks, ladder wells, and passageway. Now sweepers. So, calling away sweepers twice a day. Okay, we're going to talk. First of all, thank you for all the other veterans out here, and thanks for coming. You see the title of the presentation here: 3 ships, USS Wyoming. Well, maybe there's 4. Okay, and the reason I say that is because there were 4 ships in the United States Navy named USS Wyoming. However, the first one, which we'll talk about first, was not named after the state of Wyoming, but the valley of Wyoming in Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania. And I guess there's those of you that are Wyoming historians might know the connection, but apparently in at least a couple of Native American tongues, Wyoming means basically prairie, grassy plains, something like that. So, the state of Wyoming didn't exist when our first ship. Oh, by the way, I want to talk about the Navy flag, which we have one over here. What you see over there on the lower right-hand corner is the first Navy Jack. Now, a Navy Jack is something that a ship flies in addition to the national ensign, which is the American flag. And you fly it when you're in port. So you fly the naval ensign, the ensign from one part of the ship and the Navy Jack from the other. So that was, by tradition, it's the first Navy Jack. There is some question about whether, excuse me, I have forgive me, I have a little congestion problem. That it may not have actually been the very first Navy Jack, but traditionally it is, so that's what we're going to call it. And it was authorized by the Secretary of the Navy to be flown after 9/11 for the practical duration of the war on terror. So all commissioned U.S. Navy ships, I think except for the Arizona and the Constitution, flew that as the Jack for several years after 9/11. All right, let's get into the first USS Wyoming. She was a screw sloop, and the sloop's got to do with the rigging, and it's a barked rig. So the aftermast would have been a fore and aft mast, and the other mast would have been square rigged, and a steam sloop. So it had a boiler and a single shaft and a propeller. It's about 200 feet long, went about 1,500 tons. It had 6 guns of different sizes. It had 2 11-inch Dahlgrens, if anyone is into gunnery. Dahlgren was a gun that was invented just before World War II, and it was an extremely powerful and durable, but very large and heavy gun. And they were 11-inch guns. And when I talk about, excuse me, when I talk about guns and I say an 11-inch gun or a 5-inch gun or a 12-inch gun, that's the diameter of the bore, so the diameter of the projectile. So that brass casing that you see on top of the piano over there is a 5-inch 38. We'll talk about what the 38 caliber means later, but so the projectile that would have been fired out of that casing would have been 5 inches in diameter. That particular weighed about 55 pounds, I think the projectile would have. But the screw sloop Wyoming had 11-inch Dahlgrens. It had 4, and then the older guns were referred to rather than the bore diameter, but just by the pound of shot. So the other guns it had 4 32-pound guns with like the 32-pound shot. She was launched, as you can see, in 1859, but she was stationed on the West Coast. So when the Civil War broke out, she was assigned to chase Confederate raiders. A raider would have been a civilian-rigged ship that would have been armed, and both the Union and the Confederacy used them to raid the shipping of the enemy. The most famous of those raiders was the Confederate state ship Alabama, commanded by a Commander Raphael Semmes. And I was privileged to know his great-great-grandson when I lived in Alabama. And he's something of an expert on the Alabama, but the CSS Alabama was so successful in its raiding efforts that, and I looked it up and I've forgotten the figure, but Lloyd's of London, which insures shipping, the rates for insuring shipping and cargo worldwide went up 400%, primarily because of the CSS Alabama. So she was the prime target. That was one of the main reasons that the Wyoming was deployed to the Pacific Coast, because at that time the CSS Alabama had gone to the Pacific and was raiding U.S. shipping in the Pacific, and that was basically her mission, was to track down the Alabama. They at one point came within about 20 nautical miles of each other, but never saw each other, even though the commander of the Alabama, Raphael Sims, had said, "I think I'm a good match for her, and I intend to take her under under battle." But they never met. The most famous thing that this USS Wyoming did, and interestingly enough, you'll find as we go through the other Wyomings, that this particular Wyoming saw more action than probably all the other 3 Wyomings together. The main action that she saw was the Battle of Shimonoseki. Japan was open for trade in like 1852. Starting in 1852, you may have heard or read about Commander Matthew Perry, who took a squadron to Japan and basically forced himself on them in as polite a way as he could, and opened up trade with Japan. Well, that was a little bit of a shaky effort for a number of years. Japan didn't have a very powerful central government, and there was a what you'd call a prince. It was called a daimyo. If you saw or read the book Shogun, you probably have heard that term. Who decided, the Japanese government at the time decided they did not want to continue being friendly to Western powers, and so this daimyo decided to take it under his own authority to take any Western shipping under fire that came through the Straits of Shimonoseki. Well, trying to remember the commander's name, I apologize. But anyway, the guy who was in command of the Wyoming at the time decided that he would take care of that, so he approached the Straits of Shimonoseki and single-handedly, with one ship against 3 armed merchantmen that the daimyo had, including shore batters, went through a very narrow strait, sank one and damaged the other 3 ships, did significant damage to the batteries, which had a total of probably 32 guns against the 6 guns that Wyoming had. So it was pretty interesting what he was able to do. In all those actions, Wyoming had 5 killed in action and 6 wounded. After the Battle of Shimonoseki Strait, she went via the Cape of Good Hope, overhauled, and then returned to the Pacific in 1868 and served for a few more years, including a training ship at the United States Naval Academy, until she was decommissioned and sold in 1892, and I haven't been able to find anything about what happened to her after that. Don't know whether she was broken up or whether she was in good enough shape to go into civilian trade. So there's the first USS Wyoming. Let's go to the next one. Many of you have heard, pardon me, about the battle of the, it's typically called the Monitor and the Merrimack, but it wasn't the Merrimack. The Merrimack was the name of the Union ship hull that was captured in Norfolk by the Confederates in the first part of the Civil War, rebuilt as an ironclad and renamed the CSS Virginia. So it's really the Monitor and the Virginia, not the Monitor and the Merrimack. Merrimack was its Union name when it was a gunboat. You can see that this is 1902, so the Navy continued to build monitors. Most of them were built, I think 85% of all the monitors that were built during the Civil War, and then there were just a few built, including some double-turreted monitors in the years following that. USS Wyoming was the last monitor ever built, the last true monitor ever built. You can see by looking at her that she doesn't look much like the monitor of Civil War fame, although you can tell that it has a very low freeboard. Freeboard is the difference between the main deck and the waterline. And one very large turret was its main battery. It was also steam powered. And you can see there she was about 250 feet long and drew about 12 and a half feet of water underway. Had a coal-fired steam propulsion plant. We'll get back to that in a minute. Its main battery, and those are the main armament, the biggest guns aboard, we call the main battery, and the secondary battery would be smaller guns, and you'll hear me talk about that. Was two 12-inch 40 caliber guns. Okay, now I mentioned I would talk about what caliber means when you hear about that. Typically, if you talk about a 30 caliber machine gun, that means it's 30/100ths of an inch in diameter, but caliber for naval guns, for large guns, is totally different. Caliber is how long the barrel is in relation to the bore, or the diameter of the projectile. So, in this case, the 12-inch 40 caliber gun means that if you multiply the bore times 40, that's the length of the barrel. Okay? So 12-inch bore, that means the barrel was 40 feet long. So that gives you an idea. If you look at that shell there, if that were a 12-inch gun, it would be a foot in diameter in the barrel, and the barrel would be 40 feet long, which is probably pretty close to 40 feet across this room. And it had two of those in the main turret. It also had some 4-inch guns and some we go back to pounders, 6-pounders. Okay, so that was its battery. Its history is kind of interesting, and it's a little bit similar to the third USS Wyoming that we'll talk about, and that's that she was repurposed and name changed and that kind of thing. So, but before that happened, as you can see it on the slide there, during the Colombian Civil War of 1899 to 1902, which is the Colombian Civil War, which wound up being the Panamanian independence, and of course go from there to the building of the Panama Canal. But in support of the Panamanian independence activity, she landed some U.S. Marines in Colombia, or what was then Colombia and now Panama. Kind of wore out her usefulness at that point. So she was decommissioned in 1905 and was sat idle for 3 years, and then recommissioned as an oil-fired ship. She was the first United States Navy warship to have an oil-fired boiler instead of coal-fired boiler. So in that way, it was a little bit of a test ship and a training ship, and that's kind of what she is known for, to the extent that she is known for much of anything. Then immediately after that, they renamed her the USS Cheyenne. They called it Battle Monitor 10. And the reason they renamed it was because the Navy was going to build the next ship we're going to talk about, which is the battleship Wyoming. They decided that the battleships would be named after states, so they took the names from other ships previously named after states and assigned them to new battleships, and that was the reason for the name change for Wyoming. In 1910, not long after she was renamed the USS Cheyenne, she was modified in just a few ways, gave a little bit of machine shop and stuff like that, to be a submarine tender to kind of take care of the newest boats in the Navy, which we don't call submarine ships, we call them boats. So you can see on the next slide there, you can see there's a picture of her bow on the right and two of the submarines that she's taking care of there on the left. But even as a submarine tender, she was assigned additional duties and served to evacuate citizens during the Mexican crisis that took place, I think, in 1918, 1919. It was right after World War I. And then in 1920, she was redesignated again to IX-4, and she served as a Navy Reserve training ship. 1926, she was decommissioned and scrapped in 1939. So, interesting thing there. Go back and describe her a little bit there. Over 220 officers and crew. And if you just look at that ship, you go, geez, there's not enough room for 200 people on there. But you got to remember that in the days of sail and the days of the early ironclads and battleships after that, and And even to some extent, my first ship, we kind of stacked sailors like cordwood in there. And there's an old sailor right there that can tell you. So your first rack was a laced cloth rack about 4 racks high, right?
Right. That's what I had.
There you go. There you go. So you just have a steel or aluminum frame, and it would have a piece of canvas that would be tied around that frame thing, and a little mattress about 2 inches thick.
Oh yeah.
And in some cases, on some ships, you would use that rack when you're off watch, and someone else would use it when they were off watch.
Right.
So it takes some imagination, but I can kind of see how you could get a crew of 220 on a ship that's no larger than that. All right, let's go to the third USS Wyoming, and this is the one. You know, if you're a Navy warship guy, you know, there's two kind of ships that you really love, and those are destroyers and battleships. So yeah, battle wagons. So the first real battleships were called dreadnoughts, and they were British ships, and that kind of changed the balance of power across, naval power across the world. So there was a race by other navies to build battleships or dreadnoughts, and to some extent this class, the Wyoming class of battleship, was called a dreadnought, and it was probably the last class of battleships that were referred to as dreadnoughts, but only colloquially. There were 2 ships, and the ships were built in classes named after the first ship of the class. And there were 2 ships in this class, the Wyoming and the Arkansas, and I will say the Arkansas got the better end of the deal. Arkansas served throughout World War II and got a lot of battle honors and those things, mostly as a naval gunfire support ship for amphibious operations against the landings in the Pacific. But Wyoming was designated BB-32, and you can see she's quite a bit larger than the Monitor. 562 feet in length and 93 feet in the beam, which is the width of the ship. Now, if you were to see, when you see pictures of battleships, they look very sleek, right? But if you see a picture from a battleship from an aircraft, they're shaped a lot like a canoe. They're very broad in the beam, and the ratio between the length of the ship and the beam of a ship is the same thing for a battleship or a carrier as it is for a skull, the people that race skulls in the Olympics and those things like that. And you can see, but if you see those skulls are about 14 inches wide, and they may be, 25 feet long, and that's what gives them their speed. So there's a relationship between beam and length, and but there's a practicality. If you really wanted a faster ship, you would have it a narrower beam, but then it wouldn't be as stable in rough seas. So there's always a trade-off in ship design, and that's why she was almost, a fifth as wide as she was long, that class ship. About 26,000 tons. My first ship was a post-World War II destroyer, was about 4,000 tons. And a lot of this, and a little over 400 feet, so they're not much longer. These ships had tremendous amount of steel. They were built and constantly upgraded with thicker armor along the hull or on the main deck, or particularly around the pilot house and control spaces and those kinds of things. She had 12 boilers, 4 turbines. Instead of having piston steam engines, they had turbine engines, and steam turbine technology was pretty doggone advanced in those days. You'd be surprised to find out how sophisticated they were in those days. But she had 4 shafts and 4 propellers. She could go a little over 20 knots, and at a cruising speed, which would have probably been around 12 to 14 knots, you could get about 8,000 nautical miles out of her. A nautical mile being a little over a statute mile. Nautical mile is related to latitude of the Earth. So there's 60 nautical miles to, it goes all the way up to degree of latitude and all that sort of thing. That's why it's different. So when you hear the term, a ship can go 30 knots, well, since a nautical mile is longer than a mile, 30 knots, we're probably somewhere around 33 to 34 miles an hour. I don't know exactly, but somewhere around in there. So when you hear that a ship goes certain knots, just add a little bit to that, and that's how many miles an hour something's going. The main battery was 12 50 caliber guns, and I'll go to another slide and you'll get to see a little bit of that. And it was in, it had 6 basically double barrel turrets for the main battery, the 12-inch 50 caliber guns. Again, a 12-inch times 50 caliber, right? So that's 50 feet, barrel is 50 feet long, okay? Because the bore is 12 inches, 1 foot. It also had some 5-inch 51 caliber guns. So if you multiply 5-inch times 51, that'll tell you how long the barrel was for those guns. And they were installed in what are called casemates along the hull. And if you look, I'll probably have a better picture of it later, but if you look right there, those dark spots, those are openings in the side of the hull, openings in the hull, and those 5-inch guns would have been sticking out of those. And you can see here a double 12-inch turret, another double 12-inch turret, another double 12-inch turret, and another double 12-inch turret. So each of those double turrets, there would be 4 guns per double, so 12 12-inch guns. Pretty heavily armored for a ship of those days, but right after that, the British came out with a 14-inch gun, which made the 12-inch gun a second-class, not obsolete, but a second-class weapon. So in battleships, guns continued to grow until I think the largest bore, the 2, almost 3 battleships that the Japanese built during World War II had 18-inch guns. And the 16-inch projectiles weighed about 2 tons apiece, or excuse me, 1 ton apiece, about 2,000 pounds. I don't know how much those 18-inch projectiles weighed, but they must have been something. All right, talk a little more about the battleship Wyoming. There's a picture of Wyoming going through the Panama Canal on one of her trips. Although her first trips were to in the Caribbean and the Mediterranean. But you can see there the superimposed turrets. There's a 3-gun turret there, a 3-gun turret there, another 3-gun, excuse me, a 2-gun turret, a 2-gun turret, another 2-gun turret, another 2-gun turret, and then 2 more turrets forward. So 12 12-inch guns and 6 double turrets. Another distinctive thing about the early pictures of the USS Wyoming is these 2, what they call cage or basket masks. They look like, to me, like, remember when we were kids, those Chinese handcuffs, we called them? You stick your finger and you can get, that's kind of how they're made, actually. They're with woven steel, and there may be a better picture. There may be a better picture of it later. And here's a picture of 12-inch guns in double turrets firing. So you can see how tiny these little sailors are over here and the size of those guns. And of course, you can also see that they didn't use smokeless powder back then either. You can also see in this previous picture, you can see two stacks, what we call 2 funnels. And look how dark the exhaust is from those, because she was coal-fired at that time. Okay. Now, in 1927, she underwent a modernization, so she was given oil-fired boilers. So you can see there that there's only 1 mast, there's only 1 funnel, 1 smokestack, and it's about halfway between where the original 2 were, because in the engineering spaces, they were able to take the exhaust from the 2 boiler rooms and combine them into a single funnel. And you can see one of the cage masks or basket mask remains, a much smaller aftermast. The batteries were updated with the latest gun technology. The armor was improved. But then there were a series of naval treaties that took place globally. And in the main one, which was the London Naval Treaty of 1930, there was what you'd call today an arms control treaty. and it would generally involve the United States, Great Britain, and Japan, which had the three largest navies on the globe at the time. And at that time, it addressed capital ships, which were cruisers and battleships, and it mostly addressed cruisers, but also other ship types were involved in this treaty. And it was something called a 5-5-3 ratio. So the U.S., for every 5 capital ships that the United States and Great Britain were allowed to have, Japan was only allowed to have 3. Okay? So there were a lot of changes, and the Wyoming was one of those that was most affected, so she became militarized. She was redesignated as, instead of Battleship 32, as Auxiliary Gunnery Ship number 17. Half of her main battery of her 12-inch guns were removed. Some of the secondary guns were updated, and you can see in the picture on that slide that you can see that 2 of the large turrets are forward, and there's only 1 large 2-gun turret aft. But you can still see the 5-inch guns and casemates, some of them there that we talked about before. But the technology in those, the steel used in the barrels and those kind of things were kind of upgraded. So her profile looks significantly different. In the 1940s, they kept upgrading her. She was then serving again as a gunnery training ship. They kept upgrading her with the latest guns and gunfire control systems. The picture on the upper left there, you can see some more changes. If you look closely, the 5-inch guns that were in the casemates along the hull are now gone, and there were more modern 5-inch guns put aboard the ship to train gunners for the smaller ships, and the larger ships that also use the 5-inch guns. Since we're talking about 5-inch guns, I talked about that brass shell casing that you see up there on top of the piano. That's a 5-inch 38 caliber shell casing. So the 5-inch guns that were put aboard Wyoming at this time would have used those as the casings in their 5-inch guns. This is kind of interesting. She got nicknamed the Chesapeake Raider. She was always in Chesapeake Bay firing her guns, not raiding anybody, but it was kind of a nickname that was given to her. And it's been pretty much determined that she fired more ammunition than any warship in World War II, and maybe fired more ammunition, gunnery ammunition, than any ship in the history of the United States Navy. So far, we have this Wyoming that had the most action, and that was the screw sloop. And then we've had the Monitor, which was the first oil-fired ship, and now we've got the USS Wyoming, which fired more ammunition than any other ship in the Navy. There are some distinctions about the 4th USS Wyoming, which we'll talk about in a little bit. One of the things that she did during the 30s, and I didn't mention it before, was she did what we call NGFS, Naval Gunfire Support. One of the things that the Wyoming did was during amphibious exercises before World War II, they came up with a lot of the naval gunfire support activities that were used for our success in the Pacific and all the landings and wins. So she was, from a training point of view and from a doctrinal point of view, she was significant in that regard. Decommissioned and sold for scrap, 1947. The last slide I want to show you on the battleship Wyoming is something that shows three of her several stages of development, the difference. You can see the 2 cage masks and the 6 turrets in pairs. So there are 2 pairs of turrets aft, 1 pair of turrets forward. You see the 2 funnels when she was cold fired, and the 2 cage masks. You see the 5-inch guns and casemates. And then you see a 1935 version of her where she's now oil-fired with a single funnel. She has half as many of her main battery, and then you'll see a later version, which was the lower right-hand picture in the previous slide, of her with a lot less masts going on and much smaller guns. They got rid of the main battery guns. All right, we're almost there. This should go pretty quickly. Ballistic missile submarine. She was commissioned in 1996, and there are at least 2 people here in the audience that attended that commissioning, I'm told. Great, great. Well, my brother was there too, so maybe y'all met him. Anyway, there are 14 ballistic missile submarines of the Ohio class. There were other Ohio class submarines. Some of them started out as ballistic missile submarines and some of them didn't. Many of them have been converted to cruise missile submarines and they have other purposes. But the ballistic missile submarines, there are 14 of them, and that's part of the nuclear triad. So we have the ballistic missile submarines, we have the missiles like we had at Cheyenne, and we also have nuclear bombers, and the submarines are the third part of that nuclear triad. She was commissioned in '96, and 560-foot length, 42-foot beam, displaces 18,750 tons. You don't think of submarines as being as big as that, but they are. These SSBNs are huge. 1 nuclear propulsion plant, 1 propeller shaft. It says submerged speed 20 knots. You kind of laugh at that because you can imagine it's significantly more than that, but that's classified, and I don't know what the figure is. What can I say? Her range is limited only, I say limited only by crew provisions for a patrol. You know, at some point you'll run out of food, but you're never going to run out of power, and you're never going to run out of fresh water. Okay? Because you're always going to be making your own fresh water. And that nuclear reactor will last literally for years. So she was commissioned in 1996. We'll talk about that in a second. 24 missile tubes with these Trident missiles. I think they're up to Trident Modification 5 now, which is extremely advanced. And 4 torpedo tubes, which are pretty much for defense. So the way these SSBNs operate, they go on 3 months patrols. They have 2 crews, a blue crew and a gold crew. So the blue crew will go out for 3 months. It's rare for them to ever even come to the surface. They will go to their missile launching stations and they will patrol in that area. And then they'll come back into port and they will go through any modernizations that need to be done, any maintenance, and then provide crew rest, and the next crew, the gold crew, when the blue crew comes in, the gold crew goes out. Wyoming is stationed in Kings Bay, Georgia, which is where all the Atlantic Fleet SSBNs are home ported. She was the first one in 2011 to have female officers in her crew. Right after that, they did what was actually called a global medevac exercise, a V-22 Osprey, which is those vertical and short takeoff Marine Corps sort of helicopter creatures. Flew a 12,000-mile round trip to do a simulated medevac. So it was cool that they could demonstrate that they could do that. Not such a good distinction here is that 2013 and 2014, there were just a few of these SSBNs that had female officers on board, and one of the enlisted men figured out a way to get videos of the female officers in the shower. 13 settlers were investigated, 10 were convicted, some of them did time in federal brig, which is probably Leavenworth. Well deserved. So what did we say? She was commissioned when? 96. All right, and in 2018, it was the first time she had to be refueled. Wouldn't that be nice if we could do that with a truck these days? So they refueled her in 2018, gave her an overhaul, and then she was the first ballistic missile submarine to take on an enlisted crew as well. So there were 15 female enlisted, in addition to a couple of female officers in the crew that completed an SSBN patrol. She was the first, and other submarines are doing that now. So that's one of her distinctions. My brother said he was at the Wyoming's commission, and he worked for, after he left the Navy, he worked for Electric Boat, Westinghouse Electric Boat Division, building these submarines, and he went on her sea trials. I said, I called him up a little while ago, and I said, is there anything distinctive that I can tell the audience about the USS Wyoming? And he laughed and goes, I gained 10 pounds when I was on board for 9 days. They got the best galley in the whole Navy. He said, they don't call it the galley, they call it the chuck wagon. because of Wyoming. So that's it. Let's see. I think I completed everything here. This source is on this slide there, and I just want to thank all y'all for coming. Beat Army. I was just reminded today of the Marine Corps birthday. Any Marines in here? Well, all right. Happy birthday. Happy birthday. Thanks. Thanks, Susan. Okay. Any questions? Yes, sir.
What did they use for propellants for that type of shell?
Which one?
The big one you got there, the 5-inch.
By the time the 5-inch 38s came along, they were using smokeless powder.
But it wasn't gun cotton?
It's not, no. I'm not aware of any gun cotton. The smokeless powder that was used in the large naval guns, I used to have a few grains of it. And when I say a grain, shaped about the size of a small pencil eraser, about 3 millimeters in diameter and about 6 or 8 millimeters long. And if you could hold it up to the light, you could see through little holes, so they're kind of like a cut a hose in half that has 5 or 6 channels in it. And you could throw it just like black powder. You could throw it on a table, light it with a match, and you get a big flash of powder, but it only explodes from sonic compression. 16-inch guns and the 12-inch guns, they shoot like 6 bags of powder. They put in the projectile and they ran in 6 bags of powder and fired them. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
When Wyoming was a training ship, and it showed those smaller guns on where the main turrets were, and they were pointed up really high. Was that the 5-inch 38 or the one that came out?
Well, there are different versions of a 5-inch 38 gun. There's a 5-inch 38 gun, and then there's a 5-inch 38 dual-purpose gun. And the dual-purpose gun, the barrels were able to elevate much higher so that they could use them for anti-aircraft fire.
Right.
Question. You mentioned that China was only allowed 2 of those battleships.
No, it was, first of all, it was Japan, but for every 5 capital ships, which would be a battleship or a cruiser, for every 5 capital ships that the U.S. or Great Britain could have, Japan could have 2.
Why were they limited? Or who said they could only have 2?
They signed the treaty.
Oh, they always okay.
They agreed to that. Okay, in the years leading up to World War II, they violated that treaty, and Germany was subject to somewhat of that, and they violated it as well.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
You bet. You bet. Yes.
Yeah, did you do any research on the 1911 USS Wyoming? It wasn't a battleship. It was just a ship, but it was called the USS.
That would have been the Monitor
Was
that
that
we
the
talked
Monitor?
about, BM-10.
Okay,
That would-
okay, that was.
Now, I got to say, there was another ship named Wyoming, but it was not a naval ship. It also was a distinctive vessel. It was a commercial schooner, and it was the largest sailing ship ever built.
That's what I was talking about.
Yeah, but it was not a naval
It
vessel.
wasn't a naval vessel, no,
Right.
it was not a battleship.
Right.
But it was named because some of the investors were from
Exactly.
Wyoming.
Some of the investors, which were oil and coal men in Wyoming, invested into this giant ship.
Yeah, and one of them was a governor for a while, Brooks.
Yeah. But that was not a naval ship. And since it's a Veterans Day, we're only talking about
Yeah,
navals.
naval ships, yeah.
There you go.
I
I
thought
meant to
was
mention
real
that. Thank you for
fascinating,
reminding me of
too.
that.
Yeah.
Anything else? All right. Before I go, I know I'm running way past time here. I just kind of tend to do that. Please feel welcome to come up. Just don't touch the hat. That's a naval officer's hat from about Spanish-American War time. So the officers on the Monitor, Wyoming, would have worn that hat. The ship, the painting is known by some semi-well-known naval artists. That's the USS United States defeating the Macedonian, which was the first of the many famed victories of our frigates in the War of 1812. The big lantern on the right is a kind of a lantern that you would hoist above on the yardarms of sailing and early steamships before they had electricity to signal the status of your ship or signal other ships. And the little pennant on the showcase in there is a commissioning pennant from my first ship. Every ship gets a commissioning pennant, which is never removed until the ship's decommissioned, except of course to replace it with a new one. But feel free to look through those and flip through those books. Thanks very much.